It's my pleasure and great honor to introduce this evening's keynote speaker, Dr. Caroline Campbell, as was just said, Director of the National Gallery of Ireland, who is joining us this evening from Dublin via Zoom. Caroline Campbell has had a long and distinguished career as a scholar and curator at a number of prestigious institutions. She began as print room supervisor in the Department of Western Art at the Ashmolean Museum and at the National Gallery in London before being appointed in 2005 the Schroeder Foundation Curator of Paintings at the Courtauld Gallery, a position she held until 2018. Following this, Caroline returned to the National Gallery, first as curator of Italian paintings before 1500, then Jacob Rothschild, head of curatorial department, to become director of collections and research. In 2022, she took up her current post as the first woman director at the National Gallery of Ireland since its opening in 1864. Her career has been marked by numerous really important exhibitions accompanied by catalogs that address both scholars and the wider public. I first encountered Caroline during my years as a PhD student in London, and I recall with great excitement her early exhibitions, specifically Bellini in the East of 2005-2006 at the National Gallery, and Love and Marriage in Renaissance Florence in 2009 at the Courtauld Gallery. Other exhibitions at the National Gallery London include Duccio Caro in Dialogue 2015, Building the Picture, Architecture in Italian Renaissance Painting, 2014, and this was co-curated with Amanda Lilly, who's emeritus professor here at the University of York, and this it was the fruits of a partnership between our university and the National Gallery. Then there is Caroline's Mantegna and Bellini of 2018-19, and last but certainly not least what I'm mentioning is Caroline's current exhibition, Siena, The Rise of Painting, 1300 to 1350, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, and now on show at the National Gallery in London. And if you haven't seen it, I cannot recommend this exhibition enough. It has really been met with spectacular reviews and recently described in The Guardian as epical and heart-stopping by two different reviews. A true statement, I think, to the ways in which the exhibition can generate new scholarly questions, but also address and indeed excite the general public. Throughout her career, Caroline has sought consistently to reach broader audiences, whether through promoting art history in schools or her engaging online talks on specific works of art. And many of these my students are following still and watching. That she's delivered in different periods. And her dedication to the public knowledge of art is also evidenced in her first non-exhibition related book of 2023, The Power of Art, A Human History of Art from Babylon to New York City. So Caroline's work demonstrates how curatorial practice and public scholarship can leave a meaningful mark in the discipline, how exhibitions can actively shape the field of art history, a theme which is at the heart of her talk this evening. So I invite you to join me in welcoming Caroline, who will be speaking about museums and methodologies. How can exhibitions make art history?
Thank you. Well, I am really delighted to be with you this evening, although I have real sadness in not being with you in person. As Greg said, I was a trustee of the Association for Art History. I have also attended practically all its conferences. I think the first one I went to was in 1998, and I love the AAH and the way in which it is not just about advancing our discipline in terms of scholarship and in terms of connections, but also in terms of its mission to a wider public, because I think the two are so incredibly important. Although I am on the other side of the Irish Sea, I wanted to start by just showing you where I am. I'm showing you William Dargan, who was the railway man, who basically was the prime mover behind the foundation of the National Gallery of Ireland in the early 1850s. The gallery was founded in 1854. It opened to the public 10 years later in 1864. And indeed, my own history, like many people in Ireland, has been entwined with it. I remember very, very clearly my mother taking me to this gallery when I was a teenager. And that really being the start for me of my journey into art history, into curatorship, and into a lifetime of enjoyment and engagement with works of art. However, the magic of technology means that I can be in Dublin and I can still be with you in York, as indeed I was for a workshop session earlier today. So I feel very much that I'm part of the conference, although from further afield. And before I start, I also just want to thank the department at York, with whom I have enjoyed incredibly fruitful collaborations with many years. Through Amanda Lilly, with whom I had the great pleasure to work with on the wonderful Building the Picture exhibition in 2014, which was her initiative and was a fantastic example of how scholarship and the museum are so mutually enriched by their activity. And I know that my colleagues at the National Gallery are still very proud of the partnership that exists with York. It's a fantastic department. I'm really, really pleased that the conference is being hosted by them this year. So the subject of my talk this evening is really about how exhibitions make art history. And in 40 minutes, I'm not going to get very far on that, but I hope that I will bring up some issues for discussion and for consideration. And I'm looking really on the medium of a couple of projects that I have been involved with. I will focus on the Siena exhibition, which is currently on at the National Gallery in London. And I will also allude to a couple of our projects in Dublin, which I think are also talk to different ways that we can address this subject. Of course, before I begin, it's a truism that more people experience art history on visits to museums and galleries, physical or virtual, than through the written or the spoken word. And tonight I want to talk about one aspect of how museums and galleries enable their audiences to engage with art history. And that, particularly this evening, is the art of exhibition making. These encounters in exhibitions are not always clearly articulated, as people go to museums for a plethora of purposes, but they are nonetheless, I think, very important. Many of these encounters, certainly in a more defined sense, take place through the medium of special exhibitions. And exhibitions, or shows, as they're often called in shorthand, are by their nature showy. They are intended to make an impression. They need to inspire and sometimes to entertain, for sure, as well as to move people's emotions. They can often be educational, and their role of disseminating ideas that are already present in academic discourse is often mentioned. But in my view, this is to underestimate the intellectual possibilities that can be offered by exhibitions. And tonight, I want to argue that they are important vehicles for testing, for developing, and for nuancing research. I'm going to draw, as I said, on my experience of curating exhibitions and of working with others on their exhibition ideas to discuss how exhibitions are not simply about consuming and enjoying art. I think through what is created visually and ephemerally in a particular space, and through related writing and publications, and indeed programming, exhibitions also make art history, shaping our discipline in ways that can be surprising and unexpected, as well as the more familiar. And today, as I said, I will focus on several projects, including the current exhibition at the National Gallery in London, Siena, The Rise of Painting, which I have co-curated with Joanna Cannon, Laura Llewellyn, Imogen Tedbury, and Stefan Wollahogen. And I will also talk about the exhibition, which is sadly the reason I can't be in York physically this evening, which is called Mainie Jellett and Evie Hone, The Art of Friendship, which opens tonight at the National Gallery of Ireland here in Dublin. So I'm now hoping I will be able to move on with my slides. Oh no, here we go. Brilliant, that's working, thank goodness. Now, the questions of museums and art history are very, very, very closely interrelated and have been indeed really since the formation of both disciplines, the disciplines of museology and the disciplines of art history as an academic subject. And one of the places where this was particularly evident, I think, is the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. And I'm showing you a view into one of the Italian rooms there. I hope you can see, I hope it hasn't been cut off at the top of my slide, but basically where the architecture takes over in this space, you also see an inscription saying Italian school. The names of artists, the names of artistic schools or national schools, or indeed of famous sculptors or painters are often, we are familiar with them being written into the buildings in which many people experience their art history. And the art history which you see on the walls of these museums is often one which is chronological, not always, and it's often one which takes you really on a journey. Now, of course, art history is built up into the fabric of these buildings, but it's also expressed in through changing displays. And just in one example, again from here in Dublin, I wanted to talk about how that, of course, has evolved with changes of taste, changes of scholarship, and changes of education that have been related not just to the discipline of art history, but to the discipline and teaching of art practice. And I'm showing you here a painting from 1887 of the sculpture court in the National Gallery of Ireland. The National Gallery of Ireland, like many national museums, although very much focused on painting, was intended as a place where the arts in general could be taught. And until the 1960s, the main room of the National Gallery from the 1860s building, a room we now call the Shaw Room, after the great playwright George Bernard Shaw, was filled with plaster casts. And I'm showing you an image by the artist Richard Moynan, showing him measuring and copying a cast in the National Gallery of Ireland. A part of his artistic practice, a part of the artistic training that he was engaged with, but also something which was very performative. You can see that there are children watching this too. And of course, not just art, but art history has also developed through the practices of buildings and institutions like the one I am now honoured and privileged to lead. This evening, my talk, as I said, is really about the purpose of temporary exhibitions and the way in which they make, remake, or help to shape art history. Temporary exhibitions have really been a phenomena of museums in the last 40 or 50 years. Their history is longer, but their history with collecting institutions has really been something that has been very, very active since the 1980s. And many of you will know Frances Haskell's extraordinary final book, The Ephemeral Museum, which memorably at one moment talks about how every day as you walk through the streets of your city, there will be aeroplanes carrying works of art over your heads, going to temporary exhibitions in the places in which you live and the places in which you might visit. This phenomena has really been a phenomena in which museums have been devoted for the latter part of the 20th and the early 20th century, 21st century. It's obviously changing with climate change, but temporary exhibitions have many important scholarly as well as other purposes. And I want to talk a little bit about those purposes before I get round to the meat of exhibitions and scholarship and advancing or changing our discipline. One, of course, is popular success, providing something which people love, which provides enjoyment, pleasure, excitement in lives. And I'm showing you an image on the screen, several images, in fact, of people enjoying an exhibition at the National Galleries of Scotland in January of this year. This was a collaboration between ourselves in Dublin and our colleagues in Edinburgh. Among the many things we hold in common is a group of works by Joseph Mallard William Turner, given by the same collector, Vaughan, in 1900. We swapped these objects for the first time in 125 years. It was an absolute sensation in both Dublin and in Edinburgh. And I was very moved by my visit to Edinburgh on the 29th of January and watching people patiently queuing to see these works of art, both outside and inside the exhibition space. And the general feedback was that this was something extraordinary. It would not be repeated. These works will not travel again. This was something which meant something in terms of beauty, not to be sniffed at, and general pleasure with the people who watched and looked at this exhibition. The success of exhibitions is often measured in museums and indeed in other fora by numbers, and the numbers can sometimes be absolutely sensational. I'm showing you here an image of an exhibition, which I know some of you in the room will have seen. This was the Hilma af Klint exhibition at the Guggenheim in New York in late 2018 and early 2019. This exhibition of this previously very little known woman artist to the New York public attracted over 600,000 visitors, apparently the most in the history of that institution. So that is one way in which success is measured. Another is, of course, by press comments, by reviews. And again, many of you will have seen the marvelous exhibition curated by Karen Serre that was on at the Court institution at the end of last year and the beginning of this. I love Monet Knocks Your Socks Off. It was a truly fantastic small exhibition, but also I think which takes me very neatly onto my subject. It was a popular success, but it was also a very important scholarly endeavour. And I want to look at the question of exhibitions and their role in shaping scholarship through the project that I have worked on most recently, and that is the exhibition Siena, The Rise of Painting. I'm showing you my image of two people walking past it. One of the most exciting things as an exhibition curator is when you see images of what you've been working on a large scale. And as someone living in London, it's always just phenomenal to see these on the tube. This was a show that I and others have worked on for more than a decade. It was a very serious research project that really developed out of collaboration initially between the National Gallery and the Courtauld, and then subsequently the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We shaped our approach really in thinking of this as a project with two parts. One was the physical manifestation in the exhibition in New York and in London, and the second was the book, was the publication that we produced alongside it. It was an opportunity to explore ideas that perhaps we could not focus on in the physical display, but also a way of enhancing the experience of seeing and being part of that physical sensation in both New York and in London. The exhibition in brief looks at four painters. It looks at Duccio, it looks at Pietro and Ambrogio Lorenzetti, and it looks at Simone Martini. And it looks at them in the context of art in Siena and their wider international context. In fact, it was important to us that we would take this story not just out of Italy, but also in ways that were possible through particular loans out of Western Europe as well too. And the thesis for the exhibition, because exhibitions always have theses, even if they're there to argue against and debate, was that this was a key moment for what painting was and what painting would become in Italy and more widely in Europe. The rationale for doing this was partly the collections of the two institutions involved. It was partly the bicentenary of the National Gallery in London, something which is being celebrated through a number of important projects in the 12 months that we're in at the moment, from May 2024 to May 2020-2025. And it was also a real opportunity to think about what the origins of Western painting might possibly be, and to take that discourse outside the city of Florence, with which it's been very, very associated with, really, since I suppose the beginnings of art history as a discipline in the 16th century, through the medium, through the work of the great Aretine writer, architect, painter, and everything else, Giorgio Vasari. So this is a project which has hugely benefited from the opportunity, as I said, to explore it in a book, but also from very, very deep collaboration, from a number of voices and opinions, from the opportunity to express difference and to think about how that refines and nuances and improves all of our ideas, and to look at painting in Siena from around 1300 to 1350 from a number number of different standpoints. And this slide is really just to celebrate the other people many of the other people, not all, who have been involved in this project. And the first at the top right, nearest to me, is Professor Joanna Cannon, a figure who has been so important for the scholarship on Italian art, medieval art even, in the last 30 or 40 years, and who has been a very generous mentor to me and many of the other people in the room in York tonight. So this exhibition was a collaboration with Joanna, with Stefan Wolle-Hojen, who you see with me in front of the recreation of the Maya style, which I'll go on to, of the back predella in New York. My former dear colleague, Laura Llewellyn, now curator of Italian paintings at the National Gallery in London, and our other colleague, our dear colleague, Imogen Tedbury, whose work is very, very entwined with this project because her PhD was looking at the collecting and dissemination of Sienese art in Britain and America. And it's a great joy that she has been an important part of this project too. So we've been able to come at this project from the purposes of devotion, of materials, of manufacture, of use, of historiography, and also of institutional difference. So what exhibitions can't be is something expansive that you can find in the pages of a book. We cannot recreate the architectural context of Siena. We cannot give the sense of what it means to be in that extraordinary city and the way that it shaped its artists. So an exhibition that tries to do that is really in some ways a project that is ostensibly going to fail, because that type of approach is much better on the pages of a book or in the talk of a lecture or of a conversation, or even better still, a visit, an experiential time in that place itself. What exhibitions can be and where they get their strength, I think, is when they are focused, particularly when they're being done by collecting institutions, such as the National Gallery or the Met, on their collections. The approach, I think, really needs to be grounded and shaped by those collections. And just to remind you of the collections of Sienese painting that the National Gallery in London and the Metropolitan Museum hold, I'm just showing two works on the screen. The tiny Stockley Madonna, one of the most important acquisitions made by the Met in the last 30, if not the last 50 years. A painting that is being shown to you, far, far bigger than it is, something that really was intended to be held in someone's hands, to be cherished. But yet that small size doesn't belie its radicalism. This is an image where actually painting rather than an image is produced, really, for one of the earlier moments in Western painting. And on the right-hand side of my screen, it may be on your left, I'm sorry, I can't tell, is Duccio's Annunciation, one of the panels from the front predella of Duccio's Maestà, that is now of one of three panels from the Maestà, which is part of the holdings of the National Gallery in London. In thinking about exhibitions in a collecting institution and how, one, you're going to get the loans, and secondly, how they're really going to work and have integrity, you have to be shaped by what you have, and of course by the lacuna of the things that you don't. And one of the great possibilities that this project offered, tantalizing, and actually we were able, thanks to the great generosity of lenders, to be able to realize, was the partial reconstruction of part of one of the most seminal works of art in Italian art, if not indeed in Western art history. And that, of course, is Duccio's great double-sided altarpiece, the Maestà. I'm showing you here one of the many reconstructions that have been proposed of the Maestà. The Maestà, in brief, for those of you who don't know it, is a representation on the front of Christ and the Virgin in majesty, surrounded by the saints of Siena and indeed by the saints of heaven. And on the back, you have the story of the Passion, really, of Christ. This work was made by the painter Duccio in Siena Siena. We know that it was carried through the streets of the city. It was commissioned by the Comune or by the town council, even though it was intended for the cathedral. And it was carried physically through the streets of the city and put on the high altar, where it stood until the early years of the 15th century. It is one of the earliest double-sided works, altarpieces, to survive. It's one of the altarpieces that had the most shape on that very influential format for the production of Italian art. It is truly an extraordinary work, which began to be dismembered in the 1770s when it was cut in half. If you visit the Museo dell'Opera of the cathedral in Siena, you have the experience of walking around much of it in one space. But what you don't see are many of the predella panels. When the altarpiece was dismembered, it was partly with the expectation that these panels would leave Siena and that they would become, rather than being part of a totality, they would become fragments in collections around the world. And we have been able to reunite the surviving back predella panels of the Maestà in the exhibition in New York and in London, thanks to the generosity of colleagues from the Frick collection, the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo in Siena, the Thyssen collection, and the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, as well, of course, the National Gallery in London, where two of these panels normally reside. I think reconstructions are really interesting to think about in terms of how they move the discipline on in an exhibition, as opposed to, of course, in the pages of a book. You can do an awful lot in theory. You can do a huge amount by looking at objects in different places. And I think exhibition-based art history often ends up being art history that is very rooted in the visual, in the technical. That's not its only thing, of course. And one of the factors that has been so amazing, I feel, about bringing these objects together is that suddenly it's possible to look at the devotional possibilities that came for viewers at that time of seeing these objects together. I'd like you to focus very much on the scene of the Transfiguration, which is the second scene to the right. As I'm looking at it, and I hope you're looking at it too, you will see that on the far right there is the scene of the raising of Lazarus. To the left of the Transfiguration is the healing of the blind man. And you may be able to see from my image, but I ask you to take this further into your imagination, that the feeling of the figure of the blind man being healed at the far side of the London of that painting is looking up towards the figure of the transfigured Christ. And in the figure of the raising of Lazarus, Mary Magdalene, who's resplendent in her bright red, is also looking towards that figure too. So it's a way of how reunifications enable you to draw more attention to things that had been noticed, but you possibly didn't think about quite in that way until you actually see them together. One of the key questions for early 14th century Sienese art for its study is the question of function, the question of use, and the question also of forms that were evolving and changing in a reasonably short period of time. This is a period of great innovation in what painting can be and what painting is, separate, of course, from the possibilities of paint as a way of putting brush onto panel. And it's a moment when many of the typologies of what painting were to become are very much shaped. So we have been very lucky through this project to be able to start a long-term research project with the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo in Siena, looking at the panels from the Maestà that have survived there in collaboration with our colleagues at the Opificio delle Pietre Dure in Florence. And I'm showing you some slides of a wonderful couple of days. Laura Llewellyn, Stefan Welahogen, and others of us spent with the colleagues from Florence looking at the panels in situ in Siena. And if you come to the conference that we're organising at the National Gallery in London on, I think, the 20th of June to examine some of the issues that are brought out by the Siena show, you will hear some of this work presented for the first time. It's also been an opportunity, as I said, to think about typologies, and typologies are different at this moment. We've had the chance to look at large altarpieces, such as the parts of the Maestà, or indeed the Tarlati polyptych by Pietro Lorenzetti from Arezzo, which we have been able to display in London and New York out of its city for the first time in 700 years. And to think about the very different experience of seeing that and the works that you see on the other side of my slide. That is Simone Martini's portable, movable and changeable polyptych made for the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena in the 1320s and the 1330s. This is a subject which has been particularly a focus of Laura Llewellyn's research from the time that she was curator of painting at the John Paul Getty Museum. And I think what is very interesting about this reunification is that we know that some of these panels were made probably in the 1320s, some of them were made a bit later. They seem to share those that have many original elements left, very, very similar framing devices. The one that is most intact is the St. Luke at the far right of my screen from the Getty, and I'm just going to move on so that you can see the front and the back of that. You can see that it's decorated in a mimicry of porphyry, of stone, something that I'll come back to later in my talk, but something which is very important for the forms that these paintings are taken and the way in which we think about their use. If I go back to this image, the Palazzo Pubblico polyptych, as it's sometimes called in the literature, is an object that we are really unsure how it was fixed together, how it was used, and also were parts of this painting used at various moments and part used by other. We know that its location changes. We have information from the documentary sources, again, about its changing use, and we also now have very interesting evidence about the physical status as well, which enables us to still make hypothesizes, which we can't prove yet, but I hope we will be, in terms of how these were used and fitted together. But interestingly, they're not hinged, which is often a way of putting things together at this point. And this suggests a very different type of usage, which may indeed have been more common than we know and think today. I haven't got so long, so I want to move on to think of different ways of transmission and exchange, because these have been two further key questions for this project as an exhibition and also in terms of evolving research. And one of these I want to look at is forms and iconographies. And I want to focus this conversation very much by the two objects which are currently on the screen. One is a diptych by Pietro Lorenzetti, normally in the Lindenau Museum in Altenburg in Eastern Germany. And again, you also see a sculpture, a beautiful small-scale sculpture by Tino da Comaino, the Man of Sorrows, which is the same subject, of course, represented on the right-hand side of the diptych. Tino and Pietro knew each other. There is documentary evidence of their connection. And in the catalogue and in the research workshops we were able to hold several times at the Courtauld as we were evolving the ideas for the exhibition and for its presentation in the accompanying book. Peter Dent has spoken and written very, very interestingly about the symbiotic relationship really between these two works of art. Often when I was taught as an art historian, it was suggested implicitly rather than explicitly, I think, that painting or sculpture came first. We think this is, of course, a relationship which is more nuanced and more subtle and often more changes. And I do think that when you see this display of these two objects together in London, you will understand the complexity of thinking further about transmission and about exchange. And how motifs are used, what they mean, what their format means, what making them in different materials means, and what the differences are, as well, of course, as the iconographic similarities. Another form of transmission, of course, is that of trade and travel. And the pilgrimage route, or the Via Francigena, was so important, we know, for how people moved from as far as Canterbury to Rome from the 10th century. This was the route that was supposedly first taken, well, was first taken by the Archbishop Sigeric in 990 of the Christian era. But of course, exchange and travel is something that happens both ways. And again, this is a dialogue which has possibly not been so true until reasonably recent years in the study of Italian art. And I wanted to look at that through the example of triptychs. In the exhibition, we have been able to bring together, again, for the first time in many hundred years, two of the three documented tabernacles that Duccio made for Bishop Niccolo degli Albertini da Prato in the teens of between about 1312 and 1315. The triptych with the Virgin and Child is one of the treasures of the National Gallery in London. That with the Crucifixion, one of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And we know that there was a third triptych, which is mentioned in the bishop's will, but we don't know what's happened to that. Maybe, hopefully, at some point it will reappear. What we know, of course, was that these objects travelled. They are recorded as being with Niccolo degli Albertini del Prato in Avignon, where he's bequeathing them back to his original house in Italy. And so it's often said that the story of Sienese art is a local style which becomes an international style. And that's certainly true, but it's also a style which has been impacted on by objects coming from Northern Europe. Sometimes we can't be exactly sure about the means of this transmission. And I think the images on this screen, for me, certainly exemplify some of the problems of an approach which is overly saying one thing influences another. I'm showing you here the Crucifixion by the master Tito Castello from Manchester City Art Gallery, a crucifixion from the Gambier Parry collection of ivories at the Courtauld, and Ambrogio Lorenzetti's sublime crucifixion from the Harvard University Art Museums. What I want you to focus on here is the figure of Christ at the center and his extraordinarily long and droopy arms. Where this motif comes first, we really are not sure. And so when you're trying a type of art history that one often sees is looking for a motif and finding it elsewhere. But the story is really more complex, and we don't understand as much of this exchange and the mechanisms for it as I think we would like to. And juxtapositions like this give us really the opportunity to test and to think about the complexity of these models. Complexity is something which really we have addressed through very detailed study of a number of objects and tried to use those to address slightly more general questions. One of the perhaps most fascinating regroupings of objects that we were able to bring together for the exhibition is the group of works called the Orsini Polyptych. And I'm showing you Imogen Tedbury looking at four parts of those, the four parts that are now in the Fine Art Museum in Antwerp. There were more parts of this, and I'll show you an image of them later. This was an object which was made for a Cardinal Orsini, who was, again, one of many Italians who came to Avignon when the papacy moved. And it was an object which seems to have fitted together, again, in a sort of concertina way, or ways perhaps which sometimes could have changed as well, though in a different way to the Simone Morsini Palazzo Pubblico polyptych I showed you a little bit earlier. These formats seem very much to be associated with French ivories, a subject which Sarah Guerra has written about for our catalogue and spoke very, very sensitively about for the workshops that we held in the preparation for the exhibition. This motivation for making works as triptychs, as diptychs, as multiple objects fitted together really seems to have come into the production of painters from an awareness of objects such as the quadriptych I show you on the screen from the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Again, we know that some of these objects were documented in Bing, Italy as early as the end of the 13th century. But what artists do in any form is, of course, they don't copy. They think of new ways of doing things which are interesting for their patron, but also interesting for them. And this is one of the real sort of glories of the reassembled Orsini polyptych. Here you can see on this slide the way to Calvary from the Louvre, the crucifixion and deposition from Antwerp, and the entombment from the State Museums of Berlin at the far right-hand side of the screen. If you go and look at the other side of this object as shown in the exhibition in London, and sadly I don't have an image of it today, you see the Annunciation, you see the figures of the Virgin Mary, and you see the figures of Gabriel. And what may have happened is that this was an object that could have been used in different ways. It could have been folded together and used simply as a depiction of the Annunciation. And then on the other side, you have the story of Christ's passion, death, and indeed the promise of his resurrection being manifested on the opposite side too. And these pictures could have been used in all sorts of ways that we still don't properly and may never actually comprehend. One way in which we know that they were used, of course, is also by further generations of artists. And this is where the case of the Orsini polyptych is really, really interesting, because this object at Dijon, at Champnol, at the Chartreuse from the early 15th century. And Susie Nash, who may or may not be in the audience tonight, I can't see, has come to a theory through close looking and study in relationship to this project that the Limburg brothers in their Très Riche must have known this actual object. And she's done that through very detailed and very specific iconographic and study. But what of course is interesting by Susie's model is that the Limburg brothers are not copying. Artists never do anything as simple as that, certainly not when they're good artists. It's using that as a riff of taking the dialogue and the story on further. And really exploring, I think, in this object, what the possibilities of painting are and what can painting really do. And it's on that point that I want to end. The possibilities of painting, of course, are endless. They always change, and they change specifically by the purpose of looking. And the purpose of reuniting objects, bringing them together in an exhibition or any sort of project, is not that your scholarship is fixed, but that it continues to evolve, both that of yours and of others, as you look and think and discuss further. And an area that I think will come out of this project is really questions of meaning and of narrative. I'm showing you a detail of the left section of Pietro Lorenzetti's Birth of the Virgin. Again, a painting that really is quite exceptional in the way that it breaks barriers and traditions, but traditions that possibly had only been established as much as 20 years earlier. This is a painting that takes the form of a triptych, but actually it's a single work, and the artist plays with the sense of moving figures in between one part of the narrative to the next. I think seen most wonderfully in the figure of the woman in red, who is here to basically soothe the Virgin after her, or St. Anne after her childbirth. And of course you can see how her garment is divided between the two parts of the space. And the object which for me really exemplifies again the possibilities of painting is this tiny, tiny, wonderful object, the presentation in the Temple from the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. A painting that suddenly we're getting narrative, complexity, doubt, and artistic identity all in one small work, and signed very, very strongly at the bottom, as you may be able to see, by the artist, painted in the year 1342. I have a few minutes left to me, and I'd like just to talk about different ways in which exhibitions can increase dialogue and can evolve change in relation to several projects that we have been working on and are working on in Dublin. We have been focused over the last few years and will continue to be focused on a number of exhibition and research projects which bring some relatively understudied artists to more public and we hope more scholarly attention. And in these cases, for all of these artists that I will talk about, their under attention has largely been, in fact, it's exclusively been really because of their gender. And these again are very collection focused exhibitions which take their inspiration and their step-off point by objects that we hold in the public collection here in Dublin. And the first of these was a project that some of you may have seen, curated by my colleague Aoife Brady in 2023, devoted to the Bolognese artist Lavinia Fontana. In Dublin, we are very fortunate to have probably Fontana's greatest work that was not made as an altarpiece and not made as a portrait. And that's the presentation of the Queen of Sheba before Solomon, a work that we think was left unfinished in her studio and changed as the patronage of this object changed as well. It seems to have been made for one and then for a second Italian princely family. The picture's been in our collection in Dublin since 1870. I have to confess that it was not bought because it was thought to be a masterwork. It was bought because it was very, very, very big, and it was also quite cheap at a moment when the gallery's resources were limited and it was desperately to find as much as possible that it could put to cover the walls of its, at that point, very recently completed building. Generations of art students and lovers in Dublin have got to know the work very, very well. It's a popular work in the city, but it's one that people really haven't focused on until recently. And Aoife's project started through a very close examination of our painting, through the opportunity to do a major conservation treatment, the first for about 100 years, and also through in-depth technical study. But the second aspect that she very much wanted to look at, and which we were able to draw out more in the catalogue, was the question of, did Fontana's gender impact on the types of formats, the types of paintings, and indeed the subjects that she was able, that she began to portray. And I think very interestingly, we have these two very different portraits here of Isabella Ruini in a much more conventional marriage gaze, and then in a portrait of her as Venus and Cupid, which we think was commissioned, like the other work, at the time of her marriage in the early 1590s. Then again, Minerva Dressing, a very large painting by Fontana, which we were able to juxtapose with our great painting of the Queen of Sheba, a painting of an unusual subject, and certainly one which is depicted in an unusual way, which may relate to the circumstances of its commission, but may also relate to Fontana's unusual gender in terms of 16th century making of paintings to this large and sophisticated state. I'm going to skip through this just to finish with the project that means I cannot be with you in York tonight. And this is an exhibition which we open tomorrow, which is devoted to two of the most important figures of Irish art of the 20th century, the painters Ménie Jellett and Evie Hone. They are probably unknown to practically everybody in the audience. They are now reasonably well known in Ireland, but this has only been something of the last 20 or 30 years. And they are largely unknown because they were women, and because thanks to illness, their careers were reasonably short. I'm showing you here Evie Hone, who suffered from the effects of polio all her life, and Ménie Mary Harriet Jellett, who died in 1944 from a very, very, very horrible cancer. These are artists who are interesting because they were both peripheral and they were both central. They spent their formative years in London and in Paris, where they worked with Albert Gleis, beginning as students and subsequently as equals. And in 1923, they came back to Ireland to introduce, as they saw it, cubism, modernism, abstraction to a country which had radically changed, not just because of the impact of the First World War, but of the subsequent Civil War and the new Irish state. They were very, very interested by the art of their time and by new ideas, but their approach was often shaped by the art of the past. And I'm showing you here Mamie Jellett's Decoration of 1923, often described as one of the most radical and important paintings or important objects indeed of the 20th century in Ireland. You will note that it is painted on tempera on panel, and I think this was completely intentional because Gellert was looking at the work of Fra Angelico and of many Quattrocento painters, but she takes that to make something which is completely indeed of her moment rather than theirs. Hone and Gellert, their work was really vilified when it was first shown in Ireland. When this work was exhibited, it was accused of being something that was just so ugly. It was so terrible. Why would you make it? The exhibition closed after 3 weeks and was vilified by every critic that state at that time. But Gellert and Hone were really people who persevered. And their art really changes and evolves in ways that are incredibly interesting. Hone is a much more fluid painter. She took on the language of abstraction, but I think she's much more comfortable in working, as I think you can see from these details, in a way which is really shaped by color and by form. And she's someone who doesn't stick with rules. She breaks them. But interestingly, they both, according to the ideologies of 20th century art, that in some ways their art regresses, though that's not the way I would want to present them. They both become much more interested in narrative. They've got very, very strong faith, and they produce art which is increasingly figurative. I'm showing you here Hone's Cock and the Pot. She became an incredibly celebrated artist in stained glass from 1947. It was also easier to work at with her physical disabilities. And Mamie Jellett's Achill Horses, an extraordinary fluid and freeform work of 1941, one which she herself said was very much inspired by her understanding of Chinese painting, but also of the sense of what it was to be in the wildness of Ireland in the West, a painting that is of no moment and also indeed of many. I think I'm going to hope that this encourages you to come and see the exhibition in Dublin. But my talk tonight, to bring it to conclusion, has examined several ways in which exhibitions can make art history. And I just want to think for a few minutes about how we can take this further forward. It's important for there to be a close, even umbilical connection between collecting and displaying institutions and between the academy. Partly, this is because of audience and dissemination. But more fundamentally for us here tonight, it's because of the cross-fertilization of our discipline as art historians. Exhibitions, by their very nature, often facilitate research projects which are devoted to close looking and analysis. That has certainly been the case with Siena, the rise of painting. But as I hope I've demonstrated, it's more than possible for exhibitions to address and to interrogate other subjects of interest from a research perspective, such as in this case, as I've talked about, the dialogue between painting and sculpture, the evolution of forms of painting, or the impact of travel and other means of transmission on artistic production in 14th century Europe. And in the case of the Siena project, a series of workshops, as I've described, supported by the Courtauld Institute Research Forum, enabled us to examine these issues and to assess how we could present them, also as research questions rather than finite discoveries during the exhibition in New York and in London. Exhibitions, as I hope I've demonstrated, can also push novel lines of investigation. Lavinia Fontana, for instance, asked questions about the nature of a Renaissance woman's artist's workshop and about the nature of a woman artist's production and how or if that was different to the production of a male contemporary artist. Aoife Brady and other scholars associated with that project are continuing and further developing this research. And Maini Gellet and Evie Hone, the reason I'm not in person with you tonight, looks at a pair of artists who have, as I've said, in some senses been viewed as both peripheral and essential to aspects of the development of modernism. Essential because they were part of a core Parisian circle. Peripheral because they moved during their lives between what could be called avant-garde and more conventional artistic modes. And in addition, they were female and they were Irish. What our exhibition hopes to do is to show that these artists' lives and production was not subject and isn't subject to simple categorization. They were complex individuals and their work is also complex. Making that complexity intelligible is one of the things that art history does best, whether on the walls of an exhibition or in the words of an article or a book. Exhibitions are, as I've said, often about pleasure, and there is nothing wrong with that. But they are also about making people think by expanding their horizons and by challenging them to interpret evidence in new and sometimes surprising ways. That is how they make art history.